High above the freezing clouds of northern Europe, German aces looked at the incoming American fighters and literally laughed out loud. They were flying the Focke-Wulf 192, a sleek, lethal, darting raptor of the skies. And what had the Americans sent to fight them? A monstrous, bulbous, 8-ton piece of flying metal that looked more like a milk jug than a warplane. Over intercepted radio frequencies, Luftwaffe pilots mocked the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt, calling it a flying bathtub and an easy target. It couldn't turn, it couldn't climb. It was a sitting duck, but the laughter wouldn't last. Within 30 days, that useless flying bathtub would annihilate 39 of Germany's finest fighters, turning European skies into a graveyard for the Luftwaffe. This is the story of how the biggest joke of World War II became its deadliest wrecking ball. The rain was coming down in sideways sheets over the muddy tarmac of Halesworth, England, in the spring of 1943. Captain Thomas Griffin stood under the dripping eaves of a corrugated Nissen hut, holding a lukewarm mug of coffee, staring out at the flight line. Parked in the gloom were the massive silhouettes of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolts. Griffin hated them. Half the squadron hated them. When the United States Army Air Force's 8th Air Force arrived in Britain, they came with tales of air superiority. But the reality of the European theater was a cold, brutal awakening. The British Royal Air Force pilots, flying their gorgeous, nimble Supermarine Spitfires, had walked the Americans around the P-47S and politely tried to hide their disdain. "It's a bit substantial, isn't it, old boy?" one RAF flight lieutenant had remarked, tapping the colossal aluminum flank of the American plane. Substantial was British for fat. The P-47 Thunderbolt was the largest, heaviest, single-engine fighter ever built at the time, fully loaded with fuel, armor, and ammunition. It tipped the scales at an astonishing 15,000 pounds. To put that into perspective, the German Messerschmitt Bf 109, the terrifying standard of the Luftwaffe, weighed barely 6,000 pounds. The P-47 was essentially an armored truck with wings. Under its broad, ungraceful cowling sat a massive Pratt & Whitney R2800 double wasp radial engine, a monstrosity of engineering that required an enormous turbo supercharger housed in the belly of the plane, giving the Thunderbolt its distinctively fat, jug-shaped fuselage. A few days earlier, Griffin and his wingman, Lieutenant Daniel "Danny" Miller, had taken the jugs up for their first real combat patrol over the French coast. The briefing had been standard: sweep the airspace, look for trouble, clear the way for the heavy bombers. But the trouble found them first. At 22,000 feet, the radio cracked with static and the frantic voice of their flight leader. "Bandits! 6 o'clock high! Coming out of the sun!" Griffin craned his neck back, fighting the heavy, restrictive flight gear. Silver flashes tore through the blinding glare of the sun. It was a swarm of Focke-Wulf 190s. The German planes were sleek, aerodynamically perfect killing machines. Behind the stick of the lead, Fu 190, was Lieutenant Karl Richter, a seasoned veteran of the Eastern Front who had recently been transferred to the defense of the Reich. Richter had 30 kills to his name. To him, the sky was a chessboard, and he moved his fighter like a knight. When Richter saw the American P-47S for the first time, he was genuinely confused. The planes were so massive he initially thought they were a new type of twin-engine medium bomber. As he closed the distance, realizing they were single-seat fighters, a cruel smile crept beneath his oxygen mask. Richter and his wingmen dropped like falcons. Griffin, reacting on pure instinct and stateside training, threw his heavy control stick hard to the left, banking violently to pull into a tight defensive turn. It was the standard dogfighting tactic: turn into the attacker, force an overshoot, get on his tail. But the P-47 was not a Spitfire. It was not a P-51 Mustang. As Griffin yanked the massive plane into the turn, the jug groaned. The heavy wings shuddered. The turning radius was agonizingly wide, bleeding airspeed at a catastrophic rate. The 8-ton beast wallowed in the thin air. "I can't bring it around," Miller screamed over the radio, his own P-47 sluggishly trying to match the desperate maneuver. Richter watched the clumsy American planes bleed off all their kinetic energy trying to turn with him. It was a rookie mistake, exacerbated by an unforgiving aircraft. The German pilot didn't even have to push his plane to its limits. He simply cut inside Griffin's impossibly wide turning circle, lined up the glowing rings of his Revy gun sight on the broad tail of the P-47, and squeezed the trigger. 20-millimeter cannon shells slammed into Griffin's right wing, tearing jagged holes through the aluminum skin. The concussions rattled Griffin's teeth. He slammed the throttle forward, begging the massive radial engine for power. But the heavy plane took agonizing seconds to accelerate. "They're flying rings around us," Griffin yelled, fighting to keep the wings level. Richter fired another burst. More impacts stitched across the fuselage of Griffin's Thunderbolt. By all rights, the American plane should have folded in half and plummeted. The Favu 190's Minajels were highly explosive, designed to rip the wings off bombers. But here, the P-47 revealed its only apparent saving grace. It was built like a vault. The incredible bulk of the plane, combined with heavy armor plating behind the pilot's seat and the massive, damage-absorbing radial engine up front, absorbed punishment that would have vaporized a Messerschmitt or a Spitfire. Griffin's plane was smoking, full of holes, and missing a chunk of its left aileron. But the Pratt & Whitney engine kept roaring. Realizing they could not win a turning fight, Griffin and his panicked squadron broke off, pushing their noses down and fleeing back across the English Channel. The Germans didn't even bother to give chase. They stayed high, preserving their altitude, watching the smoking, lumbering beasts retreat. That night, British radio operators intercepted the Luftwaffe frequencies. The German pilots were in high spirits, mocking the new American fighters. Richter's voice was recorded and translated for the Allied intelligence officers. It was like shooting at flying bathtubs. Richter had laughed. "They cannot turn. They cannot climb. They just sit there in the sky, waiting to be killed. If this is the best the Americans have, the war in the air is already won." Back at Halesworth, the mood was utterly toxic. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group sat in the mess hall, in stunned, exhausted silence. Danny Miller had a bandage wrapped around his forehead, where a piece of shattered canopy had grazed him. Griffin stared into his scotch, the humiliation burning hotter than the alcohol. They were flying a joke, a heavy, unresponsive piece of junk that had just made them the laughingstock of the Luftwaffe. If they kept flying the P-47 like a traditional fighter plane, they weren't just going to lose the war. They were all going to die. The turnaround did not begin in the cockpit. It began on a chalkboard in a damp briefing room. 2 days after the disastrous encounter over France, the commander of the 56th Fighter Group, Colonel Hubert "Hub" Zemke, called his battered pilots together. Zemke was a hard-nosed, relentless tactician. He had spent time in the Soviet Union before the war, studying aviation, and he possessed a brilliant, pragmatic military mind. He did not care about the aesthetics of an airplane. He only cared about how to use it to kill the enemy. Zemke stood at the front of the room, looking at the bruised, defeated faces of Griffin, Miller, and the rest of the squadron. He picked up a piece of chalk and drew a crude, fat oval on the board. "This is your airplane," Zemke barked, his voice cutting through the heavy silence. "It is fat. It is heavy. It turns like a cement mixer, and it climbs like a wounded duck." A low grumble of agreement rolled through the room. "The Germans think it's a joke," Zemke continued, his eyes narrowing. "And if you keep trying to fly it like a Messerschmitt, the joke is on you. You cannot dogfight in a Thunderbolt. If you try to turn with an FW 190, he will get inside your radius, and he will kill you. Stop trying to be ballet dancers. You are not flying a rapier." Zemke slammed his chalk against the board, drawing a steep, aggressive, downward arrow originating from a high point. You are flying a wrecking ball. He looked directly at Griffin. Captain, how much does the P-47 weigh fully loaded? 7.5 tons, Colonel, Griffin replied flatly. Exactly. And what happens when you drop 7.5 tons of metal from 30,000 feet? Griffin blinked, processing the question. It falls fast, sir. It falls faster than anything else in the sky, Zemke said, a fierce grin finally breaking his stern expression. The Germans have light, agile planes. They are sports cars. But sports cars have a terminal velocity. When a light plane dives, aerodynamic drag eventually fights its low mass, and it hits a speed limit. The P-47 has mass, tremendous, terrifying mass. Gravity is not our enemy, gentlemen. Gravity is our best friend. Over the next 3 weeks, the squadron was grounded from combat patrols. Instead, they were subjected to brutal, high-altitude training regimens that completely rewrote the doctrine of aerial warfare. Zemke was introducing them to boom and zoom energy fighting. The concept was rooted in pure physics. They would use the P-47's massive turbo supercharger, which allowed the engine to breathe efficiently in the thin air of the stratosphere, to climb to 30,000 feet. They would fly higher than the Germans. They would wait. And when they spotted the enemy below, they would not engage in a swirling, horizontal dogfight. They would roll their heavy planes over and let gravity take over. Griffin's first practice dive under the new doctrine terrified him more than his encounter with Karl Richter. At 30,000 feet, the air was 50 degrees below zero. Ice crystals formed on the inside of his canopy. Following Zemke's orders over the radio, Griffin pushed his stick forward. The nose of the massive jug dropped below the horizon. The earth spun up to meet him. "Keep it full throttle, Captain," Zemke's voice crackled. Griffin swallowed hard and pushed the heavy throttle quadrant all the way forward. The 2,000 horsepower radial engine roared. The acceleration was violent. The massive weight of the plane, combined with the power of the engine, pulled it toward the earth at a speed that simply defied the era's understanding of aviation. 300 miles per hour, 400 miles per hour, 450. At 480 miles per hour, the entire airframe began to vibrate. It was a terrifying, bone-rattling shudder. This was compressibility, the aerodynamic phenomenon, where the air piling up in front of the thick wings approached the speed of sound, creating shockwaves that battered the control surfaces. Griffin's control stick locked up, stiff as a steel beam. "Colonel, the stick is frozen. I can't pull out," Griffin shouted, panic rising in his throat as the English countryside rushed up at him. "Don't fight it," Zemke replied calmly. "Roll the trim tabs. Let the thick air at lower altitudes give you your bite back. Trust the airframe. It won't break." Griffin desperately spun the elevator trim wheel. As the plane plunged past 15,000 feet, plunging into denser air, the controls suddenly snapped back to life. Griffin hauled back on the stick with both hands. The immense, heavily reinforced wings of the Thunderbolt groaned under the immense G-forces. The blood drained from Griffin's head, his vision tunneling into gray static. With a roaring whoosh, the P-47 leveled out, having successfully completed a dive that would have literally ripped the wings right off a Messerschmitt or a Focke-Wulf. Because the Thunderbolt was built so heavily, it could withstand dive speeds, pushing 550 miles per hour speeds. The Germans couldn't even dream of reaching without their planes disintegrating. When Griffin landed, his flight suit was soaked in sweat despite the freezing high-altitude temperatures. But as he climbed down from the wing, he looked at the massive airplane differently. It wasn't a clumsy bathtub. It was a kinetic weapon. "You see it now, don't you?" Zemke said, walking up to him on the tarmac. "Yes, sir," Griffin panted, wiping his forehead. "We don't dogfight them. We drop on them like an anvil, hit them, and use the speed to climb right back up before they even know what hit them." Zemke nodded. "And what do you hit them with?" Griffin looked at the wings. Buried inside the thick metal of each wing were 4 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns. 8 heavy machine guns in total, synchronized to fire a devastating wall of lead. We hit them with a buzzsaw, Colonel. The pieces were in place. The trap was set. The pilots of the 56 Fighter Group had stopped mourning their plane's weaknesses and had finally weaponized its overwhelming strengths. The flying bathtub was about to return to the skies over Europe, and the Luftwaffe had no idea what was coming. August 1943. The strategic bombing campaign against the German war machine was in full swing. High over the industrial city of Bremen, a massive formation of American B-17 flying fortresses droned relentlessly onward, their silver bellies flashing in the high-altitude sun. Below them, the sky was a chaotic nightmare of black flak bursts. But the real danger was rising from the German airfields. Lieutenant Karl Richter adjusted his throat microphone and signaled his squadron. They were climbing rapidly in their foe 190s, vectoring in on the bomber stream. Richter felt confident. The last few weeks had been a turkey shoot. The American bombers were heavily armed, but without effective fighter escorts, they were vulnerable. And Richter knew the American fighters, those fat, pathetic Thunderbolts, were too clumsy to protect the bombers effectively. Richter spotted the B-17S at 25,000 feet. Enemy formation sighted, he reported over the radio. No escorts visible. We will attack from the rear and sweep through them. He pushed his throttle forward, eager to add to his kill tally. He and his 12 wingmen began their deadly, creeping approach, aiming for the vulnerable tail gunners of the B-17S. But Richter had made a fatal miscalculation. He hadn't looked up, 5,000 feet above the bombers. Invisible against the blinding glare of the sun, Captain Thomas Griffin and the newly trained 56 Fighter Group were waiting. They were cruising at 30,000 feet, their massive turbo superchargers whining, keeping the engines breathing perfectly in the thin, freezing air. I have bandits. 12 o'clock low. Griffin's voice was ice-cold over the radio. Looks like a dozen Focke-Wulfs, lining up on the big boys. Copy that, Griffin, came Zemke's voice, crackling with static. You know what to do. Execute. Griffin didn't bank. He didn't maneuver. He simply pushed the stick forward and rolled the heavy beast onto its back, pulling through into a steep, terrifying vertical dive. Behind him, Danny Miller and the rest of the squadron followed suit. A dozen 8-ton anvils fell out of the sky. Down below, Richter was just lining up his gun sight on the trailing B-17 when his wingman screamed over the radio. Achtung! Above us! Americans! Richter snapped his head up. Plunging out of the sun, diving faster than anything he had ever seen in his life, were the American P-47s. They weren't wallowing. They weren't slow. They were closing the distance at over 500 miles per hour. Panic seized the German ace. Break left! Break left! He yelled, hauling his own stick to the side, trying to pull his nimble fighter out of the dive path. He expected the heavy American planes to try and turn with him, to bleed their speed, to make the same mistake they had made over France. Griffin didn't even try to turn. He didn't need to. The sheer speed of the diving Thunderbolt meant Griffin was on top of the German formation in a heartbeat. He picked out a Focke-Wulf, trying to break right. Griffin made a tiny, microscopic adjustment to his rudder. The heavy plane didn't turn. It just slid slightly through the air, bringing the Reeve sight to bear on the fleeing German. Griffin squeezed the trigger on his control stick. The roar inside the cockpit was deafening. 8 50 caliber machine guns erupted simultaneously. They fired a combined total of over 100 armor-piercing, incendiary, and tracer rounds per second. It was not a spray of bullets. It was a solid, devastating hose of kinetic energy. The heavy stream of lead intersected with the FOVU 190. The effect was apocalyptic. The 50 caliber rounds tore right through the German fighter's thin aluminum skin, as if it were wet tissue paper. Richter, looking over his shoulder, watched in absolute horror as his wingman's plane simply disintegrated. The canopy shattered, the right wing snapped off at the root, and the engine exploded in a brilliant fireball of aviation fuel. The W-190 was erased from the sky in less than 2 seconds. "My God," Richter whispered, his confidence shattering instantly. "They are too fast." Griffin didn't stick around to admire his handiwork. Traveling at over 500 miles per hour, his P-47 blew past the burning wreckage of the German fighter. He pulled back on the stick. The tremendous kinetic energy he had built up in the dive instantly translated into a zoom climb. The massive jug rocketed back up toward the heavens, climbing thousands of feet in seconds, leaving the completely bewildered German pilots far below. "Scratch one," Griffin yelled over the radio, the adrenaline pumping furiously through his veins. "I got one too," Danny Miller shouted, his plane roaring past Griffin as they climbed back to altitude. Down below, the Luftwaffe formation was in complete disarray. They tried to climb after the retreating Americans, but the P-47s were already out of range, safely perched back at 30,000 feet, casually turning their massive planes around for another dive. The Germans realized, with a sickening drop in their stomachs, that they were trapped. They couldn't outrun the Americans in a dive. The P-47s were too heavy. They couldn't outclimb them. The Americans were using their dive speed to zoom away, and they couldn't dogfight them. The Americans simply refused to turn. "They won't engage," a German pilot screamed over the frequency, desperately throwing his plane into evasive maneuvers as another wave of thunderbolts plummeted from the sun. "They are just diving and running. It's a slaughter," another voice panicked, just before his radio was cut off by the brutal roar of 8 50 caliber guns. Richter pushed his Follow 190 into a steep dive, trying to escape the kill zone. It was the standard German defensive maneuver: dive away and use the Focke-Wulf's superior aerodynamics to escape. But as he looked in his rearview mirror, his blood ran cold. A massive, blunt-nosed P-47 was right on his tail, and it was gaining on him. The laws of physics were merciless. Richter's light, agile fighter was reaching its terminal velocity. Aerodynamic drag was holding it back, but the 8-ton American monster behind him was driven by gravity and an unstoppable mass. "The flying bathtub is catching me," Richter realized with profound, paralyzing shock. "It's going to run me down." Griffin watched the sleek FO-190 grow larger in his gun sight. He could see the black crosses on the wings, the frantic movements of the pilot inside the canopy. The heavy Thunderbolt was vibrating violently, pushing past 520 miles per hour. But Griffin held the stick steady, his thumbs resting lightly on the firing button. He waited until the German fighter completely filled his reticle. The trap had been sprung, and the very thing the Germans had laughed at was now sitting right behind them. Completely unstoppable. Griffin smiled under his oxygen mask. "Who's laughing now?" he muttered, and pressed the trigger. At 520 miles per hour, the vibrations inside Captain Thomas Griffin's cockpit were violent enough to blur his vision, but his grip on the control stick was like iron. Ahead of him, the slate-gray Focke-Wulf 190 of Lieutenant Karl Richter was desperately trying to outrun gravity, but physics had already decided the winner. Griffin squeezed the trigger. The heavy Thunderbolt shuddered as all 8 50 caliber Browning M2 machine guns unleashed their payload. A blinding, continuous stream of red tracers lashed out across the shrinking gap between the two aircraft. The sound wasn't a rat-tat-tat. It was a deafening, mechanical roar, like a massive sheet of canvas being ripped in half, right next to Griffin's ear. In the cockpit of the W-190, Richter's world ended in a cacophony of shattering glass and tearing aluminum. The American rounds did not merely puncture his aircraft. They sawed through it. Armor-piercing incendiary bullets smashed into the Focke-Wulf's tail assembly, instantly vaporizing the rudder. A second burst walked up the fuselage and hammered into the BMW radial engine. Richter felt a concussive shockwave punch through the floorboards. Hot oil sprayed backward, instantly coating his canopy in a blinding black film. The nimble, elegant German fighter, which just weeks ago had flown rings around the Americans, convulsed like a dying animal. The control stick went completely slack in Richter's hands. The control cables had been severed. "Bailing out. I am bailing out," Richter screamed into his radio, ripping his oxygen mask away. He threw the canopy release lever. The rushing air tore the glass roof away, violently sucking the breath from his lungs. Richter hauled himself out of the burning cockpit, tumbling into the freezing slipstream. As his parachute snapped open, violently arresting his fall, Richter dangled in the harness and looked up. What he saw chilled him to the bone. The massive American fighter, the flying bathtub he had mocked so relentlessly, didn't even slow down. It blew past his falling, burning Fu 190 with a terrifying roar, the slipstream visibly twisting the air behind it. But the most terrifying part was what the American did next. Griffin didn't circle. He didn't turn to confirm the kill. Using the monumental kinetic energy gathered in the dive, the Thunderbolt pulled its nose up and rocketed vertically back into the stratosphere, shrinking to a dot against the sun in mere seconds. It was a perfectly executed boom and zoom. Richter hung in his chute, the cold reality settling over him as the remnants of his squadron scattered and fled below. The Americans had stopped trying to dance. They had brought a sledgehammer to a fencing match. Back at the Halesworth airfield, the damp English air was pierced by the deep, throaty rumble of returning Pratt and Whitney engines. The ground crews, who had grown used to seeing their pilots return, defeated and shot up, stopped their work. The Thunderbolts were coming in fast, and they were performing victory rolls. Griffin's heavily armored jug touched down, the massive tires screeching against the tarmac. When he finally pulled off his leather flight helmet, his hair was matted with sweat, but a fierce, manic grin was plastered across his face. Lieutenant Danny Miller hopped down from his own wing a few yards away, practically vibrating with adrenaline. "Did you see it, Griff? Did you see it? I dropped on a Messerschmitt from 20,000, and he just exploded. He couldn't get away." Colonel Hub Zemke was waiting by the debriefing hut, an unlit cigar clamped between his teeth. He watched his pilots swaggering across the tarmac, the crushing weight of their previous humiliations completely gone. Alongside Griffin and Miller, rising stars of the 56th Fighter Group like Robert S. Johnson and Walker Budmaharan were animatedly using their hands to describe the vertical dives, their voices overlapping in excited shouts. Zemke pulled the cigar from his mouth. "Report, Captain," he said to Griffin, though Zemke's eyes already knew the answer. "We bounced them from 30,000, Colonel," Griffin said, his voice hoarse from yelling in the cockpit. "We didn't turn once. We dropped, fired, and climbed. They panicked. They tried to dive away from us. And," Zemke pressed, "and nobody outdives a Thunderbolt, sir," Griffin smiled. "I ran a Focke-Wulf down like a freight train hitting a bicycle." Zemke nodded slowly. The tactics worked. The massive supercharger, the sheer weight of the aircraft, the devastating battery of 8 machine guns. It was a combination the Luftwaffe was entirely unprepared for. That night, the mess hall at Halesworth wasn't a place of quiet mourning. It was a war room of predators. They gathered around the chalkboards, refining the angles of their dives, calculating the exact moments to pull out, and discussing how to bait the Germans into giving up their altitude. They stopped calling themselves a fighter group. Under Zemke's ruthless, tactical leadership, they began referring to themselves as something else entirely. The Wolf Pack was born, and they were about to unleash hell on the Luftwaffe. September 1943. The skies over Europe transformed from a German hunting ground into an American abattoir. The word spread rapidly through the Luftwaffe squadrons. Do not let the Thunderbolts get above you. But it was an impossible directive to follow. The P-47s, heavily relying on their massive turbo superchargers, could comfortably cruise at 30,000 to 35,000 feet altitudes, where the German Daimler-Benz and BMW engines began to gasp for air. losing horsepower and performance. The Americans simply claimed the roof of the sky and waited for the German fighters to rise to meet the bombers. What followed was a 30-day period of aerial slaughter that would cement the P-47's legacy. In just 1 month, the 56th Fighter Group alone systematically annihilated 39 German fighters. It was a staggering number, completely reversing the kill-to-loss ratio that had plagued the American forces earlier in the year. Every day was a repetition of the same brutal physics equation. German interceptors would climb to attack the B-17S. The Wolfpack would spot them from above. The Thunderbolts would roll over, converting their 7.5 tons of mass into a terrifying 500 mile-per-hour plummet. The sky would fill with the white-hot laser beams of 50 caliber tracers. Aircraft would shatter, and the heavy American planes would zoom back up to the safety of the stratosphere before the surviving Germans could even orient themselves. The German pilots were becoming desperate. The renowned Luftwaffe General, Adolf Galland, reviewed the combat reports with mounting horror. His best pilots were being swatted out of the sky by a plane they had dismissed as a joke. Galland realized that fighting the Thunderbolts at high altitude was suicide. He issued a new, urgent directive: drag them down. The Germans knew the P-47 was a high-altitude monster, but at low altitudes down on the deck, below 10,000 feet, the dense air negated the Thunderbolt's dive advantage, and its massive weight became a severe liability once again. Down low, the nimble Bf-109S and Fw-190S regained their edge in acceleration and turn rate. On the 18th of September, Griffin and Miller were escorting a battered formation of B-24 Liberators back from a brutal raid over the rail yards at Münster. They were flying low at 12,000 feet to stay with the damaged bombers that couldn't maintain altitude. "Keep your eyes peeled, Danny," Griffin warned, scanning the horizon. "We're out of our element down here. The air is thick, and the jug feels sluggish." "I got 'em, Griff. 3 o'clock low. Messerschmitts. Looks like they're trying to bait us." Griffin looked down. A flight of 4 Bf-109G fighters was cruising just above the treetops, flying parallel to the bombers. They were agonizingly slow, practically begging the Americans to dive on them. It was a classic trap. If the P-47S dove down to the deck, they wouldn't have the altitude to zoom back up. They would bleed their speed and be forced into a turning fight at low altitude, exactly what the Germans wanted. "Hold your altitude," Griffin ordered. "Do not take the bait." But the Germans were cunning. One of the Bf-109S suddenly pitched its nose up and fired a long, looping burst of cannon fire at a smoking B-24. The bomber shuddered, losing altitude. "Damn it, they're going to finish off that straggler," Miller gritted his teeth. "I'm going in, Griff." Before Griffin could stop him, Miller rolled his heavy P-47 and went hurtling toward the deck. Griffin cursed loudly in his oxygen mask and followed his wingman down. The trap was sprung. As soon as Miller leveled out over the trees to line up his shot, the seemingly sluggish Bf-109S snapped into violently tight turns. The dense air at sea level gave the light German fighters incredible grip. In seconds, a Messerschmitt had completely reversed its direction and was glued to Miller's tail. "I've got one on me. I can't shake him," Miller yelled, yanking his heavy stick left and right. The P-47 wallowed in the thick air, its turn radius massive compared to the darting German. Griffin shoved his throttle to the firewall, roaring over a small French village, trying to clear Miller's tail. But another Bf-109 dropped from a cloud bank directly behind Griffin. Thud, 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 bang. Griffin's plane violently jerked to the right. The sound of 20mm explosive cannon shells detonating against his armor. Plating sounded like someone beating the side of a metal dumpster with a sledgehammer. The heavy steel plate behind his seat caught a piece of shrapnel that would have otherwise severed his spine. "I'm hit, taking heavy fire," Griffin shouted. In any other aircraft, Griffin would have been dead. A Spitfire or a Mustang would have folded under the impact of the Meningesco shells. But the flying bathtub was built like a flying tank. Griffin looked out his window. The right wing had a hole in it the size of a manhole cover. The aluminum skin peeled back like a tin can. But the main spar held. The German pilot behind Griffin, frustrated that the massive plane hadn't broken apart, aimed for the engine. A burst of machine gun fire stitched across the nose of the Thunderbolt. 2 cylinders of the massive 1.8-cylinder Pratt & Whitney radial engine were instantly blown clean off. Black, viscous oil violently sprayed across Griffin's windshield, immediately blinding him. Smoke poured into the cockpit, smelling of burning rubber and high-octane fuel. The engine violently sputtered, shaking the entire airframe as if it were trying to tear itself off the mounts. "This is it," Griffin thought, his heart hammering against his ribs. "We came down to their level, and we're paying for it." "Griff, your engine is on fire. Bail out," Miller screamed over the radio, having finally managed to use a brief burst of speed to run away from his own pursuer. Griffin reached for the canopy release. But then, a miracle of American engineering occurred. The radial engine, unlike liquid-cooled engines that would seize immediately if their coolant lines were cut, was air-cooled. Even missing 2 entire cylinders, even spewing oil across the French countryside, the massive double Wasp engine kept churning. It sounded like a washing machine full of rocks, losing a significant amount of power. But it stubbornly refused to die. "Negative, Danny." Griffin coughed through the smoke, wiping a small, clear patch on his oil-slicked canopy with his gloved hand. "The Jug is still flying. I'm keeping her." With his engine crippled and his plane full of holes, Griffin couldn't dogfight. He could only fly straight and level. The German pilot behind him, seeing the smoking, crippled beast, lined up for the final kill shot. But Griffin still had mass. And he still had armor. As the German fired, Griffin hit the rudder hard, slipping the heavy plane sideways. The cannon shells sparked and bounced off the heavily armored fuselage and the reinforced root of the wing. The German pilot, flying a much lighter plane, had bled off too much speed in his tight maneuvers to catch the P-47 inches, a straight-line sprint, even a crippled one. Griffin pushed the nose down slightly, aiming for the English Channel. The rugged, indestructible nature of the Thunderbolt was suddenly on full display. It wasn't just a heavy hitter from high altitude. It was an airborne shield. For 40 agonizing minutes, Griffin flew over the frigid waters of the Channel, his engine clanking and grinding, spitting oil and smoke. He was losing altitude by the minute. When the white cliffs of Dover finally appeared through his oil-streaked canopy, he was barely at 500 feet. When Griffin's wheels finally slammed onto the runway at Halesworth, the right tire blew out, and the massive plane ground looped, spinning violently before coming to a halt in the muddy grass. The engine gave one final, violent shudder and died. The crash trucks raced to the smoking wreckage. Zemke was in the lead jeep. When Griffin popped the canopy and climbed out, covered in oil and soot, the ground crew stared in absolute disbelief. The plane was a wreck. It had over 200 bullet holes in it. The right wing was shredded. 2 cylinders were missing from the engine block. Zemke looked at the shattered airplane, then looked at Griffin. "You brought this thing back?" Zemke asked, his voice a mixture of awe and disbelief. "She brought me back, Colonel," Griffin corrected, patting the soot-stained metal of the fuselage. "They caught us low. They shot us to pieces. But they couldn't kill it." The low-altitude ambush, intended to break the wolf pack, had the exact opposite psychological effect on the Luftwaffe. When the German combat reports filtered back, detailing how a P-47 had taken direct cannon hits to the engine and wings, and still managed to fly across the English Channel, despair set in. The Americans hadn't just brought a weapon that was terrifyingly fast in a dive. They had brought a weapon that refused to die. By the end of that 30-day period, The myth of the flying bathtub was dead. The laughter over the German radio frequencies had been replaced by panicked shouts and static. The Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had destroyed 39 of the Luftwaffe's finest fighters, completely rewriting the rules of aerial combat. It was no longer a joke. It was the undisputed heavyweight champion of the European sky, and the war was turning violently in its favor. By the winter of 1943, the bitter cold of the English countryside was matched only by the icy ruthlessness of the 56th Fighter Group. The flying bathtub had completely shed its comedic reputation. The Luftwaffe had learned to fear the high-altitude dive of the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt. But the war was shifting, and the commanders of the 8th Air Force realized that the sheer survivability of the Thunderbolt made it suited for a job even more dangerous than dogfighting: low-level ground attack. With the arrival of the sleek, liquid-cooled P-51 Mustang, a fighter with the internal fuel capacity to escort bombers all the way to Berlin, and back the massive Thunderbolts were gradually relieved of deep penetration escort duties. Instead, they were strapped with 500-pound bombs under their bellies and highly explosive HVAR, high-velocity aircraft rocket, projectiles under their wings. Captain Thomas Griffin stood on the frozen tarmac of Boxted Airfield, watching the armorers winch a massive olive-drab bomb onto the undercarriage of his beloved Jug. The aircraft, already a gargantuan machine, now looked like a flying armory. "They want us on the deck, Griff," Lieutenant Danny Miller said, his breath pluming in the freezing air. He tapped the thick steel casing of a rocket, strafing trains, busting tanks, hitting flak towers. "It's suicide. Down there, every farmer with a rifle can take a pot shot at you." Colonel Hub Zemke stepped out of the command tent, joined by a rising ace who was quickly becoming a legend: Francis Gabi Gabreski. Gabreski, a Polish-American pilot with a fiery temperament and a genius for aerial gunnery, had already proven that the Thunderbolt was an executioner's weapon. "It's not suicide, Miller. It's localized demolition," Gabreski interjected, adjusting his fleece-lined collar. "The Mustang is a beautiful ship, but you put one bullet in its liquid cooling system, and the engine seizes in 3 minutes. You're a glider. The Jug? The Jug doesn't care. It's an air-cooled anvil. You can shoot half the cylinders off, and it will still drag your backside across the channel." The briefing was short and brutal. Their target was a heavily defended German rail yard near Rouen, France, packed with munitions destined for the Eastern Front. They were to cross the coast at 0 feet to avoid radar, pop up over the tree line, deliver their ordnance, and strafe anything moving. An hour later, Griffin and his flight were skimming the choppy, gray waters of the English Channel at 250 miles per hour, flying so low that the massive 4-bladed propellers were whipping up sea spray onto their windshields. The tension in the cockpit was suffocating. High-altitude combat was clinical, a game of geometry and physics. Low-altitude combat was a chaotic, muddy, terrifying brawl. As the French coastline rushed up to meet them, Griffin pushed the throttle forward. Wolfpack, pull up, and arm switches. Target is 2 miles inland. The massive Thunderbolts roared over the sand dunes, scattering German sentries. The landscape became a blur of green fields and stone farmhouses. Then, the rail yard appeared. It was massive, choked with black steam locomotives and flat cars loaded with panzer tanks. But it was also bristling with defense. Before Griffin could even align his gun sight, the sky erupted. It wasn't the black, puffy explosions of high-altitude flak. This was light, rapid-fire anti-aircraft artillery, 20 millimeters and 37 millimeters, tracer rounds, crisscrossing the sky in a blinding, neon-green net of death. "Flak! Heavy flak everywhere!" Miller shouted over the radio. "Stay on the run," Griffin barked, locking his eyes on a massive ammunition train. "Drop your eggs and brake hard." Griffin pressed his plane into a shallow dive, flying directly into the teeth of the anti-aircraft fire. The noise was apocalyptic. Shrapnel pinged and hammered against the armored underside of the Thunderbolt like hail on a tin roof. A 20mm shell detonated against Griffin's left wing, tearing a massive, jagged hole through the metal. But the heavy dual wing spars held firm. He lined up the locomotive in his Reeve sight, waited until the black iron boiler filled the glass, and squeezed the bomb release on his stick. Feeling the sudden, jarring lift as the 500-pound weapon detached, Griffin yanked the heavy stick back, pulling the immense weight of the jug up just as the bomb impacted. The explosion was catastrophic. A shockwave of orange flame and pulverized steel chased Griffin's tail, lifting the heavy fighter and violently tossing it forward. "Good hit, Griff. The whole yard is going up," Gabreski called out, banking his own massive plane to unleash a volley of rockets into a line of fuel cars. But the Germans were returning fire with desperate ferocity. To Griffin's right, a young pilot named Harrison took a direct hit to the canopy. His Thunderbolt pitched violently upward, stalled, and slammed into a brick warehouse, vanishing in a fireball. "They're tearing us apart down here," Miller yelled. His plane was skimming a line of trees, pursued by a rapid-fire flak gun mounted on a flatbed car. "Use your guns, Danny. Suppress them," Griffin ordered, hauling his plane into a wide, agonizingly slow turn through the thick air to support his wingman. Miller leveled his wings and pressed the trigger. The 8.50 caliber machine guns roared. At this low altitude, firing at ground targets, the sheer volume of lead was devastating. The kinetic impact of the heavy, armor-piercing incendiary rounds literally sawed the wooden flak tower in half. The German gunners disappeared in a cloud of splinters and red mist. But as Miller pulled up, a hidden 37mm flak cannon, positioned in a concrete bunker, fired a point-blank burst. A shell slammed directly into the belly of Miller's P-47. The explosion rocked the entire formation. Thick, acrid white smoke immediately poured from the underside of Miller's aircraft. "I'm hit. Belly's on fire. Oil pressure is dropping to 0. Miller's voice was frantic. "Climb, Danny. Trade speed for altitude. Get ready to bail," Griffin yelled, forming up on Miller's smoking wing. Miller fought the heavy controls. "I can't. The elevator cables are shredded. I have no pitch control." The P-47 was losing speed, dropping dangerously close to the tree line. Bailing out at 300 feet was a guaranteed death sentence. The parachute wouldn't have time to open. Miller was trapped in a falling tank. "Cut the engine, Danny. Put her in the dirt. Ride it out," Gabreski commanded over the radio, his voice an anchor of cold logic in the chaos. Miller killed the massive Pratt & Whitney engine. The deafening roar of the radial pistons died, replaced by the terrifying rush of wind and the screech of tearing metal. The colossal, 8-ton fighter sank like a stone toward a muddy French beet field. Griffin watched in horror as Miller's plane hit the ground. A lighter fighter, a Spitfire, or a Messerschmitt would have cartwheeled, digging its nose into the soft dirt and flipping violently, breaking the pilot's neck. But the P-47 had a secret weapon for exactly this nightmare. Its massive, barrel-like fuselage was reinforced with heavily armored keel beams along the bottom, designed specifically to protect the bulky, turbo supercharger and the pilot in the event of a belly landing. The Thunderbolt hit the mud at over 140 miles per hour. A massive geyser of brown dirt and crushed crops exploded into the air. The heavy metal belly acted like a colossal ski. It didn't dig in, it plowed. The 8-ton beast carved a trench, 400 yards long through the field, shedding its wings, crushing its cowling, but keeping the central fuselage entirely intact. When the smoking ruin finally slid to a halt, Griffin circled low, his heart in his throat. The cockpit canopy violently kicked open. A tiny, soot-covered figure clambered out of the wreckage and furiously waved both arms at the sky. Griffin let out a breath he felt he had been holding for 5 minutes. The bathtub had just survived a crash that would have pulverized any other aircraft in the European theater. The Thunderbolt had proven its ultimate worth. It wasn't just a killer. It was a protector. By the spring of 1944, the P-47s of the 9th Air Force were systematically dismantling the German transportation network. They destroyed trains, pulverized convoys, and shattered armored columns. The German infantry learned to dread the silhouette of the fat-winged fighter. They called it the Jabo, Jag Bomber, and its presence overhead meant absolute annihilation from the sky. Late November 1944. The skies over Germany were gray and choked with the ashes of a dying empire. The Luftwaffe, bled dry of veteran pilots and starved of high-octane aviation fuel, was a shadow of the terrifying force it had once been. But like a wounded predator, it still had one final, venomous strike left. Captain Griffin, now a major and a seasoned ace, with 14 kills painted on the fuselage of his P-47, was leading a high-altitude sweep near the German city of Osnabrück. The Wolfpack was cruising at 32,000 feet. The war felt like it was winding down, but Zemke's brutal training kept them sharp. Never get complacent. Gravity is still your best friend. Keep your heads on a swivel, Griffin commanded, his eyes scanning the endless expanse of clouds below. Intelligence says they have something new flying out of this sector. For 30 minutes, the sky was empty. Then, Gabreski's voice cracked over the channel, sharp and urgent. Bogey. 12 o'clock low. Fast. Jesus, Griff, it's too fast. Griffin pushed his face against the cold glass of the canopy. Far below them, skimming above a layer of stratus clouds at roughly 20,000 feet, was a shape he had never seen before. It had no propeller. Its wings were swept back like a predatory bird, and it was moving at a speed that defied the limits of piston engine physics. It was the Messerschmitt Me 262, the world's first operational jet-powered fighter. Look at the speed on that thing, Danny Miller murmured, having returned to flight duty a month after his crash, now flying a brand-new bubble canopy P-47D. It's doing over 500 in level flight. The Me 262 was Germany's desperate wonder weapon. It was nearly 100 miles per hour faster than the fastest Allied fighters. In a straight line, nothing could catch it. The Mustang pilots were already reporting terrifying encounters where the jets simply blew past them, fired their devastating 30mm cannons, and vanished before the Americans could even turn. "He doesn't see us," Griffin said, his heart rate spiking. The German jet pilot was relying on his unimaginable speed for safety, cruising in a straight line, likely looking for bombers to butcher. But the jet pilot had forgotten the golden rule of the Thunderbolt. He was flying at 20,000 feet. The Wolfpack was at 32,000 feet. "We can't catch him in a tail chase," Griffin stated, running the tactical geometry in his head. "If we try to swoop in behind him, he'll just open the throttle and walk away. We have to anticipate. We have to drop the anvil right on his head." Griffin calculated the jet's incredible trajectory. He didn't aim for where the Me 262 was. He aimed for a patch of empty sky miles ahead of it. "Wolfpack, on my mark. Push over. Full throttle. Do not pull out until you see rivets." Griffin shoved the heavy stick forward. The massive P-47, weighing over 8 tons with its full load of fuel and ammunition, inverted and pointed its blunt nose straight down at the earth. Gravity, the faithful ally of the 56th Fighter Group, took hold. The acceleration was terrifying. The altimeter unwound in a blur. 30,000 feet. 28,000 feet. 25,000. The airspeed indicator crossed 500 miles per hour, then 530, then pushed toward 550. The immense, heavily armored airframe shuddered violently as it brushed against the sound barrier. Compressibility threatened to freeze the controls, but Griffin expertly rolled his trim tabs, letting the thick air at lower altitudes bite into the control surfaces. Down below, the German jet pilot felt entirely secure. He was flying the pinnacle of aviation technology. He glanced at his mirrors. Nothing could possibly be behind him. He was wrong. Falling out of the stratosphere like a meteor, Griffin's Thunderbolt was matching the jet's speed through the sheer, unstoppable force of mass and gravity. The gap closed with terrifying suddenness. At 560 miles per hour, Griffin's P-47 violently juddered as it plunged through the cloud layer, breaking out directly above and behind the Me-262. The German pilot caught a glimpse of a massive, bulbous shape in his rearview mirror. Panic seized him. He slammed his dual throttles forward, trying to coax more thrust from his Jumo jet engines. But jet engines in 1944 were slow to spool up. He tried to turn, banking the sleek jet to the right. But Griffin was already there. The P-47 didn't turn. It just fell like a sledgehammer. Griffin lined up the Revy gun sight, pulling the heavy stick slightly to compensate for the extreme speed, and squeezed the trigger. The 8.50 caliber machine guns roared, spitting a blinding stream of armor-piercing tracer rounds. A wall of kinetic energy slammed into the futuristic jet. The heavy American bullets tore right through the Me-262's swept right wing, shattering the delicate turbine blades inside the jet engine. A massive plume of black smoke and fire erupted from the engine pod. The jet violently snapped to the right, out of control. The German pilot ejected, the canopy blasting away as the world's most advanced fighter plane tumbled toward the German countryside, destroyed by an 8-ton propeller plane that the Luftwaffe had once called a flying bathtub. Griffin hauled back on the stick with all his strength. The G-forces crushed him into his seat, his vision tunneling into gray fuzz, as the Thunderbolt's incredibly strong wings absorbed the punishment of pulling out of a 550-mile-per-hour dive. The plane groaned, but it held. It always held. As Griffin zoomed back up to altitude, rejoining Gabreski and Miller, he looked out at his heavy, fat, ungraceful airplane. It was covered in soot, vibrating, and ugly as sin. But it was the undisputed king of the sky. By the time the guns fell silent over Europe in May 1945, the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt had compiled an astonishing record. The aircraft that German aces had initially mocked as a clumsy flying bathtub finished the war with over 3,700 aerial victories. More importantly, it had dropped over 132,000 tons of bombs, destroyed 86,000 railway cars, and obliterated 6,000 armored vehicles. It was never the most elegant plane on the tarmac, and it never possessed the graceful lines of a Spitfire or a Mustang. But the P-47 was a triumph of brute force engineering. It taught the Allied forces that mass and gravity could be weaponized, and it taught the Luftwaffe that arrogance is fatal. The pilots of the 56th Fighter Group, taking a perceived failure and turning it into a devastating strength, proved that the deadliness of an aircraft lies not in its beauty, but in the iron will of the men flying it. The joke of the skies ultimately delivered the punchline that broke the German war machine.